The morning sun spilled molten gold over the Montana wilderness, casting slanted rays across frost-laced pine needles and russet leaves clinging to the last days of October. Sarah Mitchell stepped from her aging Subaru, pushing the door closed with her hip, the sound muffled by the brittle cold. Breath blossomed white before her face. The thermometer on the dashboard had hovered near freezing, promising a day on the cusp of winter. Beside her, Jim scrubbed his mittened fists together, watching their exhalations swirl and vanish. "It's colder than I thought," he murmured, stamping boots in the gravel. His pack looked oversized, but Sarah insisted he carry his own water, just enough to feel like a real adventurer. "Cold means the nutcrackers will be busy," Sarah replied, offering him the compass she'd retrieved from the glove box. "Want to lead the way?" He grinned, lips chapped, freckled cheeks ruddy. "Are there bears here?" "Not likely today," she said. "They're probably hiding out already. But keep an eye out for tracks." The trailhead marked the entry to Flathead National Forest. Sarah checked her phone, battery at 70%, and fished the GPS from her bag. The charge icon blinked red. She frowned, remembering last night's distraction, the rush of packing, Jim's questions about her field notes. Not the start she'd planned, but confidence trickled in on habit. She knew these woods had mapped them all autumn. They set off, boots crunching through a layer of hoarfrost and early snow, the air high and clear with distant birdsong. Clark's nutcrackers called faintly, metallic and sharp, a promise of data waiting somewhere ahead. The trail cut deep into a mixed forest. Hemlock, cedar, fir, trees crowding tight, the world reduced to green needles and shifting shadows. Jim asked questions as they walked. "What happens if we see a moose? What's the fastest way back? Do nutcrackers remember people?" Sarah answered, her gaze scanning the ground for dropped cones, her mind half on research, half on the adventure of being out with her son. Jim's dad had called just before sunrise, something about a forgotten homework assignment. Sarah banished that thought as easily as she did the guilt for leaving voicemail instead of speaking, focusing instead on Jim's sure stride ahead. After half an hour, the path veered toward the river. She checked the compass, holding it level, confirming they were headed northeast, just as planned. The sun was rising strong, burning away the remnants of fog. Sarah breathed deep. Earth pine, a faint whiff of wood smoke carried on the wind. They stopped at a fallen log to rest, Jim peering into the hollow, searching for signs of squirrels. She took out her notebook, jotting preliminary observations, the GPS blinking again. She should have charged it. She should have remembered. Guilt flickered, quickly suppressed. When they moved on, the sky was deep blue, unmarred save for high feather white clouds. The confidence of familiarity wrapped Sarah like a cloak. She had hiked this forest for months, mapped its twists and turns, its secret clearings. Jim darted ahead, chasing a jay's raucous cry, and she allowed herself a smile. They crossed a tiny stream, Sarah balancing on loose stones, Jim leaping for the largest with practiced ease. He hooped as he landed, arms pinwheeling, then scrambled up the opposite bank. Sarah followed, eyes trained to the subtle slope, the twin trunks of landmarks she'd logged. All was as she'd expected, until the world changed in a heartbeat. A wind rose from the north, sharp and insistent, carrying the taste of metal and moisture. Fog crept low along the ground, at first a gentle veil, then a rolling tide of gray. Within minutes, visibility dropped. The sun's warmth fell away, replaced by icy fingers snaking through zippers and fleece. The path ahead dissolved into a maze of shadows and pale drifts. Sarah fumbled for the GPS, pressing the power button harder than needed. Still dead. A slow thud echoed in her chest. Guilt, sharper this time. "Stay close, Jim," she said, voice carefully neutral. "Fog like this comes and goes. We'll wait for it to lift." But the fog didn't lift. It thickened, growing denser, swallowing the forest whole. Jim's outline had blurred to a whisper of color even a few feet ahead. Sarah beckoned him closer, resisting the urge to panic. Her thoughts scattered. Matches, sure. Thermos, check. Sandwiches accounted for. No tent. No sleeping box. Overconfidence had bred carelessness, a realization hardening with every lengthening shadow. They tried to backtrack, Sarah scanning for boot prints in the snow. The fog swirled, fresh flakes obscuring the shallow impressions she'd made not a half hour earlier. Each tree felt indistinguishable, her landmarks lost in a swirl of uniform trunks and swirling mist. Jim tugged at her sleeve. "Mom, I think we were here before. That tree, it has 2 trunks." Sarah studied it. She knew she'd marked it by photograph only that morning. "Let's try left," she said, masking uncertainty with a brisk tone. But they circled, the world growing smaller as visibility shrank further. Jim's gloves were damp, his jacket darkening at the cuffs. She counted steps, looked for distinguishing marks, but every direction spun them back to sameness. Cold seeped in, her feet numb, her next movement slower. "Mom," Jim's voice was tight. "Didn't we pass the burnt log already?" She knelt, drawing him near. "Yes," she admitted, voice low. "We're moving in circles." The fog's thrown everything off. Uncertainty flickered in Jim's eyes, replaced by something she hadn't seen before, a doubt in her authority, her invincibility. Guilt stabbed again, deeper than before. Sarah forced herself upright, shoulders squared, every muscle tensed against panic. "Here's what we do," she said, stealing her resolve. "We stop. We think. We still have food, hot chocolate, matches. We find shelter before dark and wait for the fog to clear." Jim nodded, but his young face betrayed fear. Sarah tried to muster confidence, drawing on lessons learned in childhood. Her own father's mantra, "If you feel lost, don't move until you know." First shelter, then warmth, then signal. The world was shrinking as dusk arrived early, fog bleeding into the encroaching night. Sarah's breath quickened. If it didn't find shelter soon, the forest's gentle beauty would become lethal. She took out her notebook, scribbling the time, her location guesses, the angle of river sound far off to the east, if only the fog would lift. Jim shivered. Sarah put an arm around his shoulders, offering more warmth and comfort. She glanced back at the faint boot prints trailing into whiteness, vanishing even as she watched. Marks in snow, a symbol of everything slipping out of control. Tomorrow, they would mean something else. Tonight, they meant fear. Sarah pressed forward into the thinning light, her arm wrapped protectively around Jim's shoulders. They moved carefully, each step a tentative promise against missteps and unseen hollows. The fog, now tinged with the violet shadows of approaching night, seemed alive, hissing through pine boughs, swirling around their feet, softening all sound until even the trill of nutcrackers faded to memory. Their clothing grew heavier, sodden from melted snow and breath. The thermos, precious and warm, became a touchstone of comfort. Sarah pulled it out, unscrewed the cap, and handed it to Jim. Steam unfurled into the icy air, fragrant with chocolate and memory of home. Jim sipped, cradling the cup, watching his mother's hand shake slightly as she reached for her own drink. "Should we make a fire now?" he whispered, fear curling in his voice. Sarah hesitated. Their matches were boxed, wrapped twice in plastic against moisture, but she knew every misused spark was a risk. "Not yet. We need to find somewhere safe, away from the wind. Jim nodded, biting his lip. They shared the first sandwich, dividing it as evenly as possible, the bread stiff from cold. Sarah pushed away thoughts of calories, rationing the long hours until morning. With night pressing closer, Sarah scanned the landscape, searching for any sign of shelter. The forest became an intricate maze, every bough and branch transformed by cold and darkness. They tried retracing their steps, but the snow grew deeper, the ground a patchwork of ice and dead leaves. Their own tracks quickly swallowed with each fresh flake. The soundscape shifted. Cracks echoed as would split somewhere in the gloom. Age-old trees surrendering to cold, and the shrill cries of nutcrackers returned, fainter now, as birds settled for the night. Beneath it all, a persistent, low shuffling haunted their steps. Sarah's heart thudded, nerves strained between primal caution and the urgent push toward survival. After 20 minutes, their path looped impossibly. The burnt log, the lightning-stricken pine, the peculiar double stump. Jim stopped, eyes wide, his voice thin as ice. "Mom, we've been here again. Are you sure?" Sarah knelt in front of him, her own calm fraying. "We're lost, Jim," she said, voice low and even. "We'll get through this, but we need to find shelter. Right now." Jim blinked, fighting tears, then nodded, determination mingling with fright. They pressed on, shoes crunching through the snow, leaving desperate tracks, symbols of loss, scattered and uneven. Sarah tried to memorize each landmark, every bent sapling and jagged stone, but fatigue gnawed at her, mental maps blurring under stress. The temperature plummeted. Sarah checked her watch. Barely 6, but darkness choked the sky. She held Jim's hand tighter, feeling his pulse as much as her own. Their breath formed clouds, then vanished instantly, replaced by sharp, metallic air biting exposed skin. On impulse, Sarah steered them toward the distant echoes of water. Flathead's riverbank perhaps, or some smaller runoff, the promise of an open space. Their journey slowed, forced by uneven terrain, icy patches, tangled roots reaching like fingers beneath the snow. Jim tripped twice, both times scrambling up with a muttered apology. "Let's rest," Sarah said, glancing around for cover. She spotted an overhang, a slumped shelf of rock protected by spruce, its shadows deep with promise. There! They hurried over, the relief of a wall at their back immediate. Sarah assessed the site. Windbreak, dry patches under the ledge, hints of old animal scat, but nothing fresh. "Good enough. Stay close. Get a jacket zipped. Wiggle your toes and fingers," she instructed, working quickly. Jim obeyed, shivering but silent. Sarah layered their spare shirts together, wrapping Jim in their emergency blanket, pressing her body to his for warmth. She emptied their packs, inventorying supplies. Thermos, only half full. One sandwich wrapped, matches, water bottle hardened with ice. "No sleeping box, no tent." She cursed herself but shoved the guilt down. Focus was survival. Outside, night deepened. The ambient sounds of the taiga and fog became both threat and comfort. The ceaseless cracking, whistling, crunching, shifting of branches. Sarah stared into the blackness, senses sharpened, reading the forest's moods. She gathered kindling, dry twigs from beneath spruce, scraped handfuls of old needles, hunted for birch bark, scoured for any fragment not sodden by snow. It was a delicate process, hands numb, movements deliberate. "Jim, count the matches," she said quietly. He did, methodical, hands steady. 9 left. "Let's save them," she replied. "Tonight, we'll hold until we really need a fire." He nodded, watching his mother with a mix of trust and terror, his small frame tucked under her arm. She pressed her cheek to his hair, murmured comfort she barely believed. Hours passed. The two huddled under stone and spruce. Sarah fought to keep them both alert, stretching fingers and toes, sipping hot chocolate in ration gulps, whispering to Jim about her own father's stories, about constellations that might peek through if only the fog lifted. The world shrank to the circle of their breath, the steady rhythm of hearts beating against winter's threat. Tracks in the snow, lost and uncertain, lay behind them. The campfire sat unlit, its promise deferred but not abandoned. Hope flickered in the tight space between Sarah and Jim, a fragile ember waiting, ready to ignite when the moment was right. Night unraveled in slow, relentless strands, enveloping Sarah and Jim in the cold arms of the Montana wilderness. Beneath the natural rock overhang, Sarah molded the scant resources of their world, two battered jackets, one wavering emergency blanket, a half-filled thermos, and ration matches, into a fragile shield against the growing darkness. The fog had loosened its grip on the landscape, but not on their hearts. Sound swelled in the absence of sight. The distant hush of wind through pine, the brittle snap of frozen twigs underfoot, the shuffling uncertainty of nocturnal creatures testing the world at its limits. Sarah forced herself to listen, not for predators, but for the rhythms of survival, for cues she'd learned in childhood forest trips, for the ways her father had taught her the forest breathes at night. She worked quickly, collecting only the driest bits of spruce and pine from the earth nearest the rock wall, scraping away layers of snow and decomposing needles. Jim watched, silent but alert, mimicking her every movement as she broke twigs, peeled bark, and arranged the beginnings of campfire. "Let's start small," Sarah murmured, glancing up at her son's face, anxious, attentive, pale in the dying light. "Dry birch and the smallest sticks first. We save matches if we set this right." Her hands shook, not just from cold, but the tremor of responsibility. The last few hours haunted her. Wrong turns, lost tracks, the confession she'd forced herself to make. Now everything depended on her ability to coax fire from the wet woods. Jim handed her the matchbox, counting in a whisper as she struck one, then another. The first fizzled, a quick hiss and snuff. The second burned longer, catching the curled birch, licking at the twigs with orange tongues, then faltered, leaving only smoke. Jim's breath hitched, a child's patience tested by urgency. Sarah sorted through the remaining kindling, hands damp and stiff. "Try under the spruce, Jim. Sometimes you find bits that are dry beneath all the layers." He followed her directions, crawling beneath the low boughs, digging in the grit, retrieving a handful of sticks that, while cold, snapped clean, dry at the core. Sarah arranged these, next to thin cones of birch bark, careful, whispering encouragement not only to her son, but to herself. The third match produced a genuine spark, catching birch and then, slowly, the small dry twigs. Sarah shielded it with her hands, breathing gently, feeding it bits at a time until, finally, a fragile flame grew. Jim smiled, warmth radiating through the tension in his shoulders. A moment hung between them, relief, surprise, awe in the ancient magic of fire. Sarah built upward, adding graduated sticks, then thicker branches, until the flames reached tall enough to brighten the battered shoes and melt a circle in the snow. They sat together, close to the warmth, drinking slow sips of hot chocolate, sharing the last sandwich crumb by careful crumb. Jim leaned into his mother, still trembling. How did Grandpa survive being lost? Sarah looked at him through the flickering firelight, mostly through calm. He said panic was the real enemy. He kept a rhythm, collect water, find dry ground, keep the fire alive. He sang to himself, learned the stars, made tools from whatever he could find. Jim nodded, the lines of worry on his forehead softening. "Are you scared?" She answered honestly, "Yes, but we'll manage, Jim. I promise." Above them, the sky cleared. Stars sharpened against the black, vast, endless pricks of light. Sarah pointed, tracing constellations familiar and strange. "Polaris there. North Star. Our way out, maybe. If dawn is clear, we follow her. Grandpa showed me. Long before you were born." Jim stared, awestruck. So even lost, when not really lost. She nodded, silent gratitude forming in her heart. A gift of clarity in adversity. As the night deepened, new sounds swept in. The wind keened through cracked branches. Unseen animals rustled in the brush, warily circling the warmth. Sarah tossed fresh pine onto the fire, the crackle, and sent a shield against fear. She stared into the darkness, ever watchful, the urgency of the day giving way to the vigilance of survival. Jim drifted to sleep, his breath evening out as the fire carved circles of orange light around their little camp. Sarah kept vigil, feeding the flame, measuring the hours in increments of warmth and hope. Her thoughts cycled through regret and resolve, reminders of all she hadn't done, all she still could. How a single careless evening could unravel into this sharp edge, and how determination might build a way out. With every fresh branch and gentle adjustment, Sarah reclaimed a fragment of autonomy, a sliver of agency. Cold scraped at her bones, but the fire burned on, a symbol of change. Not just fear and consequence, but the steady, fragile hope of survival. Outside the cocoon of fire, the forest pressed closer, its ancient limbs arching overhead, its voice whispering thousands of miles of secrets into the star-pierced night. Sarah listened for threats and comforts alike. The wind gnawed at loose bark and sent lacy snow dust swirling among the roots. And somewhere, far off, an owl called with ragged authority. She felt every minute drag across her nerves as she watched Jim sleep. He was curled tightly against her, one arm flung above his head in a gesture formed in infancy, even as his jaw clenched against the chill. In rare moments between feeding the fire, Sarah rested the back of her hand on his cheek, feeling the living heat, the difference between defense and danger, between winter's hunger and a mother's resolve. The forest painted surreal scenes in the fire's uncertain light. Trees transformed to spectral shapes, shadows gripped and loosened with every gust. Sarah's mind flickered with memory. Late evenings spent piecing together grant budgets, phone calls with Jim's father about forgotten pickup times, the lonely victories of her solitary career. Here, in these few square feet of shelter, all ambition shrank before necessity. Every breath, every movement balanced on survival. Volumes of ancestral worry seeped in. Sarah recalled her own mother, the way she'd wake through storms, cross the house to check for fever or fright. She wondered if maternal fear was inherited, if she'd ever truly forgive herself for today's mistakes. With each fresh stick placed on the fire, she composed silent apologies, felt them burn and dissolve in the smoky air. She looked out into the black for evidence of the river, straining for the distant hush she'd noticed before sunset. It was there, barely audible, a rushing pulse threading through the encroaching silence. Sarah listened, mind drawing maps. If dawn broke clear, perhaps she could navigate by sound alone, following water to safety, just as her father had taught. Hope, bitter and necessary, crept in. Above, the sky blossomed wide. Stars multiplied, crowding the spaces between branches, their cold fire indifferent to the drama below. Jim stirred, eyelids fluttering, and Sarah traced constellations for him. A distraction, a lesson, a comfort. He named Cassiopeia, pointed to the Big Dipper. The North Star gleamed and gave them something solid to hold. Will we see anyone tomorrow? Jim whispered, eyes focused on the horizon the fire could not reach. We'll make sure of it, Sarah said, touching his hair, promising with a certainty she no longer truly felt. They ate the last, shrunken crumbs of their sandwich, chasing memories of taste through dry mouths. Steam from the thermos dissipated into the night, the warm chocolate a miraculous salve against hunger. For a moment, surrounded by the security of ritual and flame, they imagined themselves home. Jim on the living room rug, Sarah at her desk, the world simple and safe. Sarah felt the instinct to signal for help, but the fog and forest made her feel invisible. She wondered about creatures passing on silent paws, sentinels to their ordeal, and half believed the woods would keep their secret until spring. She pressed on, feeding the fire, calculating how long their fuel would last. When Jim drifted back into sleep, Sarah's own vigilance sharpened, made clearer in the solitude. The wind rattled the rock face. Loose snow cascaded down, forming lacy sculptures that glittered, then dissolved. Once a fox approached the edge of firelight, small, rust-colored, eyes reflecting back the torch. It paused, cautious, then melted away. Inside Sarah, regret built layer by layer. For the GPS, the rush, the missed signs, the way pride slipped into recklessness. She cataloged every mistake, measured each decision against its cost. But alongside regret lived love, clear and raw, radiating toward Jim, toward this desperate, necessary act of endurance. When the fire's glow began to dim, Sarah replenished it with a handful of branches, watching as the embers reignited and warmth returned. She felt herself slipping into the strange time of survival. Minutes marked not by clocks, but by a child's breathing, by the swell and fall of wind, by the cautious step of nocturnal life. Finally, as nights softened into the pale shimmer of early dawn, Sarah saw fog begin to lift in ragged pockets. The rush of water grew kindlier, less ominous, more guide than threat. A signal that perhaps now, after all, direction could be found. Jim awoke, bleary-eyed but curious, and Sarah smiled into the new day, her hope recalibrated in the clarity of necessity. A final patrol around their meager camp confirmed nothing larger than fox or hare had come close. The river's sound beckoned, and the sky held promise. For now, warmth and vigilance. For now, survival. Tomorrow, the path would be written anew. Morning in the mountains was neither gentle nor forgiving. As the gloom of night faded, Sarah found herself counting the dull aches in her body, the hunger in her belly, the persistent chill in her bones. Jim sat slumped beside her, rubbing sleep from his eyes, his face shadowed by fatigue, but brightening as the first uncertain sunlight trickled through icy branches. "Do you hear it, Mom?" he whispered, peering beyond the rock overhang. Sarah listened. Yes, there it was, the swelling hush of moving water, persistent, drawing the ear with its liquid promise. For a moment, she let herself believe in rescue, in roads and firesides, and the normal world beyond the wild. But the pulse was distant and the journey to it uncertain. They packed quietly, folding what little there was to fold. The emergency blanket was stiff with frost. The thermos held only a finger of chocolate, stretched thin with melted snow. Sarah's watch displayed no bars. Time would have to be measured by movement and sky. With her arm around Jim, she guided him into the undergrowth, aiming toward the sound of the river. Frost bit at their ears and cheeks, crisping every breath. The forest, verdant and intimidating, reshaped itself with every step, the slick underfoot, the tangles of birch and pine, faded trail markers swallowed by snow. Jim stumbled often, boots slipping on hidden roots, but he endured, shoulders squared. Once he muttered a complaint, but Sarah stopped, leaned down, and murmured encouragement. "You're doing amazing. Let's rest every 20 minutes, okay?" He nodded. When his legs refused to go further, Sarah knelt and, despite the protest of overstrained muscles, hoisted him onto her back. She felt every pound, her bones ground against fatigue, heart pounding with effort. But Jim smiled, his small fingers kneading her shoulders in grateful silence. The forest thickened as they descended. Sunlight flickered, silver and weak, through the layers of cloud and branch. Sarah eyed every trunk for a blaze or a notch, any sign that humans had marked this world before them. After nearly an hour, a thin scar on an ancient cedar caught her eye. An old blaze, faded but deliberate. "We're on a trail," Sarah breathed, hope flickering. Jim's lips curled in determination, the ordeal of the night softened by each sign that the world was not indifferent. The blazes appeared again, barely visible beneath snow and bark, leading them in a loose line beside the river, ever westward. Another hour of halting progress brought change. Snow began to fall in swirling curtains, heavy and fast. The world contracted into a cocoon of white, visibility shrinking until even Sarah's outstretched hand seemed unfamiliar. She cursed under her breath. Weather like this was dangerous, camouflaging hazards, erasing landmarks. Jim shivered, but did not complain. His face was raw, patches of frost lining his eyelashes. "I'm okay," he insisted, voice brittle. Sarah's jacket was soaked, every layer pressed to her skin. She dug deep for resolve, eyeing the faded trail and ignoring how her own willpower was ground thin by exhaustion and failure. "Almost there," she whispered, though she did not know. Suddenly, through the blizzard, shapes emerged. Angular, unnatural, dark against the white. A building slouched in a clearing, half collapsed but upright. A cabin, or part of one, its door adrift on battered hinges. "Mom, look!" Jim's hope crashed past fatigue. They hurried, slipping more often than stepping, collapsing at last beneath the sloped eaves. The cabin was older than Sarah expected, logs blackened by weather, moss and lichen inscribing secrets into every joint. The door creaked open at her touch, surrendering a sigh of musty air. She paused, cold suspicion gnawing at her instincts. "Stay behind me, Jim." Inside, gloom reigned, thick, damp, the scent of mold and wood smoke lingering. Sarah listened intently, every muscle alert. The silence within was nearly complete, except a sound, heavy breathing, slow, ragged, a low groan, muffled, tentative. Sarah's grip tightened on Jim's arm, and she motioned for him to stay back. The world narrowed to that doorway, to the threshold between cold and danger, between safety and unknown threat. She announced herself, voice trembling but clear. "Hello, is anyone here? We're lost. A woman and child. We don't mean any harm." The breathing stopped. The silence became oppressive. Then, from deep within the shadows, a voice, ancient, weakened. "Help, please." Sarah stepped inside, heart thudding, senses flaring. Sarah paused at the threshold, every sense hyper-alert. The cabin's gloom pressed in, the odor of wood rot and old smoke, of lives that lingered before and perhaps never left. She peered into the darkness, her eyes straining for the source of the ragged, human sound. Her mind raced, flashing images of mountain men, fugitives, wild animals stumbled in the cold. Was help waiting inside? Or was this another danger? The breathing continued, a rough, shuddering effort, punctuated by strained movement and a soft moan. Sarah reached for her son, positioning him behind her, body a physical barrier between the unknown and his childhood. Her fingers curled. She had no weapons, only resolve and desperation. Slowly, the cabin's shapes resolved, a battered cot against the far wall, a scatter of objects, old boots, a battered medical kit, a flashlight, a hunting knife beneath rags. Bundled on the cot lay a figure. She advanced, shoes crunching on the warped, splintered boards, her own heart beating so loudly she felt the rhythm in her fingers. "Please," the voice whispered, thick with fever. "Don't leave." Jim gripped Sarah's jacket, his gaze darting between the cot and the gloom beyond. The figure on the bed was a man, old, perhaps 50, gray in beard and hair, though time and cold had etched him beyond his true years. His skin shone with fever, blotched and ruddy. Sweat stained his brow despite the chill. The cot was littered with rags, and one leg was bound in layers of torn clothing, dirty and damp. Sarah crouched, maintaining distance. The man blinked, pupils unfocused, hand trembling as he tried to reach for the medical kit. "I'm hurt," he rasped. "Bitten or cut, don't know." "Infection. Who are you?" Sarah asked, voice low, calm by necessity. Jim barely breathed beside her. "Peter. Peter Mason. I work the fire watch, ridge trails and cabins. Came out last week, got caught in a trap or rock, lost the trail." He managed, words fragmented by pain. Sarah's mind worked fast. Field medic training, years of wilderness experience, maternal vigilance. "How long have you been here?" 4 days, maybe 5. Hard to say. Fever keeps coming. I tried the radio, but it's silent." He gestured weakly toward a bulky shape in the corner, a battered two-way set, knobs askew. Sarah pulled the medical kit closer. "May I see your wound?" He nodded, hand falling limp. Sarah peeled away layers, careful not to worsen injury. Angry red swelling, streaks of infection, the heat radiating off his skin. It was bad. Without antibiotics, septic shock was only days away. She cleaned as best she could, using melted snow and what was left in their thermos. Jim handed her bandages, eyes wide, learning in helpless silence. Jim shrank from the smell, strong, sharp, both earthy and sickly, but handed Sarah a strip of cloth, holding it gingerly. "Will he be okay?" Sarah answered in truth, matching fear with hope. "He needs rest. And heat. I'll do what I can." They set about transforming the cabin. Sarah scraped together bits of dry wood from the corners, found a few stray logs stacked near the stove. She built a fire, flame biting quickly in the protected space. The heat bloomed, driving cold out of corners. Jim wiped dirt from a battered dish and filled it with snow, setting it near the fire so water could melt. Peter drifted, semi-conscious, half in fever's grip. Sarah worked swiftly, rationing food, 1 can of beans, a handful of crackers tucked in a tin. She divided them by necessity, leaving most for Peter, giving Jim what she could, saving some for the hours ahead. As the fire crackled and the room brightened, the reality of their situation sunk in. This cabin was shelter, yes, but also prison. No way out, no working radio, no guarantee of rescue before supplies ran thin. Sarah studied the boots, the knife, the battered backpack in the shadows. She found a battered map, ink faded from time. "Where's the nearest road?" she asked, tracing lines with her forefinger. Peter's voice scratched from his throat. "A couple of days west. But there's a winter station north along the river. Radio there sometimes works. It's farther but safer. Too far for me now. Too far for a child, I think." Jim looked at Sarah, his trust battered but whole. "We stay, right?" Sarah nodded, squeezing his hand. "We stay. We help him, and we help ourselves." The outside world pressed tight around them, snow deepening, ice crawling up the edges of windows, wind rattling wood. Inside, Sarah kept the fire feeding. Each movement became ritual: fold, measure, test, comfort. Her own energy mapped and expended with careful calculation. As dusk fell, Peter roused, lucid for a moment, eyes clearing. "You should go," he muttered, voice ragged. "Take the boy. Leave me here. Save yourselves." Sarah shook her head. "We don't leave people behind. We don't risk the child, not out there, not now." Jim's gaze sharpened, a small flame of courage burrowing deeper. Sarah saw the moment. Her son, changed by the ordeal, learning that compassion and survival were tangled together in the dark. Night came again. Sarah checked the door, barricading as best she could with split boards. The fire roared, pushed against the cold. Above, wind howled, a living thing, searching for cracks to invade. That night, Jim awoke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright beside his mother. "Mom, something's outside, something big." "I heard scratching." Sarah listened, tense. The sound was real, a deliberate scraping against the logs, ragged and slow, echoing through the bone-deep hush. Predator or scavenger, seeking warmth, scenting food, testing boundaries of the human refuge. She held Jim close, searching through the sleepless intervals for threat. The scratching persisted for minutes, then faded. Sarah lay awake long after, her mind wrestling with dread and hope, her will arrayed against both. Inside the battered cabin, surrounded by snow and forest, three souls huddled between fire and uncertainty, learning new shapes of fear and, slowly, of courage. Morning inside the cabin came with dull, uncertain light, gray drifting soft across rough walls, illuminating the exhausted faces gathered by the fire's feeble glow. Sarah crouched near the stove, coaxing embers into reluctant flame, her movements measured by equal parts fatigue and necessity. Outside, the world was silent, ice feathered on window glass, and a hush of snow pressed at the door. Peter's breath rasped unevenly. Jim pressed a mug of melted snow water to his lips. Peter drank with shuddering effort, sweat blooming on his brow despite the chill. Sarah studied his face, searching for traces of lucidity behind fever. His leg had worsened overnight, swollen, streaked with angry red, taut with infection. Sarah cleaned the wound again, using their last scrap of antiseptic and the remnants of the thermos water, her fingers tender but efficient. Jim watched, grasping the battered medical kit with newfound purpose. A silent apprentice to desperation. Peter muttered half-coherent words, slipping between the present and a fog of pain. Went north for the stations, needed to check boundaries. Found the trap too late, 7 days, maybe. Should have brought more supplies. Damn luck. Sarah scanned the cabin, listing assets and weaknesses. The can of beans, a handful of crackers, the battered radio, the now nearly empty wood pile. Her own body was weak with cold and hunger, her mind taut as wire between hope and the certainty that Peter needed help she could not give. She shifted her focus, heat first, then hygiene, then sustenance. The woodpile would last another day if rationed by hours, if the fire was managed with precision. She taught Jim how to twist branches and stack logs to maximize warmth, how to watch for embers that might leap to fabric or flesh. For Peter, she concocted a rudimentary compress, used a piece of Jim's undershirt soaked in boiled water and laid it over the wound, then wrapped it with clean cloth scavenged from cabin stores. The process was excruciating. Peter bore it silently, eyes clenched, each muscle trembling. When Sarah finished, he collapsed against the cot, mouth slack with relief. "Keep talking to him," she whispered to Jim, voice careful not to betray uncertainty. "Stories, whatever you remember." Jim nodded, bending over Peter, recounting odd facts about nutcrackers and rivers, half-forgotten tales of their own neighborhood. The child's calm, more studied than instinctive, seemed to cut through the haze for Peter, grounding him in fleeting moments to the present. Sarah returned to the battered backpack and rifled through contents. A few painkillers, a dead cell phone, two faded photos of a woman and a Labrador, a notebook scrawled with maps and coordinates. She found a tick embedded near the wound, removed it carefully, hoping it wasn't the root of infection, but holding doubt in her heart. Outside, the wind howled in rising fury, driving ice against the walls. Sarah checked the windows. Small slants of daylight revealed fresh snow mounting up, sealing the cabin further from the world. Peter woke again as dusk approached, his voice crackling weakly. Nearest place for help, Winter Station, maybe 10 miles. Radio there. Can't walk. Not with this leg. Sarah sat beside him, Jim tucked near her elbow. "We can't go. It's too dangerous. Not with Jim. Not until you're stable." Peter tried to rise, his hands trembling, intent on making his point. "You should leave me, go to the station. Save the boy. Forget the man with one bad leg." Sarah's answer was swift, her conviction coiled tight. "We're a team now, Peter. You save this cabin. That's worth more than a fast run to nowhere. We'll figure it out together." Peter's eyes blinked slowly, uncertain and grateful, then drifted shut, the fever dragging him back down. In the lull, Sarah divided what little food they had, placing a few beans and crackers beside Peter, then giving Jim all but a taste. She ate last, half a cracker, a sip of water, filling her belly with pride and resolve instead of calories. Night returned with unforgiving speed. Sarah guided Jim through chores, checking wood, rearranging blankets, melting snow for drinking water. She found joy in the learning, in the quiet partnership against the cold and dark. Their tasks ballooned into rituals, Jim pressing snow into pots, Sarah measuring each dry stick, their movements synchronized by necessity. Each exchange layered new meaning. Survival was no longer just a battle against nature, but a practice of compassion shaped by hardship. Outside, the world howled. Inside, hope lingered, shaped by fragile alliances and the warmth of a slowly dwindling fire. Long hours of night layered themselves over the cabin, thick and inescapable. Sarah hovered between hope and exhaustion, listening for Peter's breathing and for the sounds of the weather's moods outside. Snow battered the roof and howled around corners, sometimes sullen, sometimes shrill, always indifferent to the drama and nestled within. Twice that night, Peter woke in shivering pain, his eyes wild with fever dreams. Sarah gripped his hand and pressed the damp cloth to his forehead, murmuring assurances that faltered against the reality of dwindling resources. Jim, stubbornly awake, watched from carefully arranged blankets on the floor, hugging his knees, his childhood narrowed to this flickering moment of duty and fear. A moment came when Peter surfaced from the tremors, a lucid interval piercing the layers of fever. He met Sarah's gaze, a broken sort of calm in his face. "If I go out, you promise you keep going?" he rasped. The words stumbled in the frozen air. Sarah shook her head, the finality in her voice a shield. "Nobody is going out alone. Not you, not Jim, not me." Peter coughed, tried to laugh, but only managed a weak groan. "You remind me of my own daughter. Never listens when told what's best for her." Jim, hearing this, moved closer, wary but curious. He held out the battered field notebook he'd found among Peter's effects. "Will you tell us about the trails?" His small voice carried purpose, an anchor, a kind of living hope. So Peter tried, voice soft and fragmented. He spoke of winter patrols through forests that seemed endless, of how to read coyote tracks in wind-packed snow, how hunters used old birch scars as beacons in storm. He traced rivers on the map with his finger, breath rattling, filling the firelit hours with the wild's unwritten laws. Sarah listened with gratitude, and with guilt so sharp it made her draw breath. Each story was a distraction and a lesson, but also a reckoning. If she'd stayed on mapped paths, if she'd been less proud, if she'd trusted caution over confidence. Regrets swelled, only slightly dulled by Peter's gentle teaching and the heat of the flame. She divided rations by dusk and again by midnight. Most went to Jim, some to Peter, almost none to herself. Her body was hollowed out by adrenaline, running on reserves of will. Yet the rhythm of caretaking kept fear at bay. Water heated, compresses changed, fire tended, a blanket rearranged, a story exchanged. When Peter drifted to sleep again, Sarah pressed her head against the window's frosted pane. Beyond the glass, stars carved hard paths through the sky. The snow's surface glittered, silent and deadly beautiful in moonlight. Her heart beat in her throat. Survival was a lattice work, 1,000 small decisions, some made in error, some in hope, all woven by the desperate love of mother for child. In one small hour, Jim rose restless, shuffled to Peter's cot, and straightened a slipped blanket. He sat beside the sick man, patience and anxiety locked in his jaw, the boy now less frightened of the stranger. He placed the battered compass in Peter's palm and asked timidly, "Did you ever get lost out there alone?" Peter managed a broken smile. "Plenty of times, but I always trusted the small things, the river's voice, the shape of drifts, the way cabin smoke looks at dawn. That's what brings you home." He squeezed Jim's fingers for strength. Outside, the wind dropped at last. In the hush, Sarah ventured outside to gather more snow for drinking water. The cold was sharp enough to bite through her boots, but the silence carried a fragile peace. The taiga shone beneath pale starlight, a moment of beauty in the heart of adversity. She turned her face upward and, for the first time in days, felt the faint solace of belonging. Not power over the wild, but kinship with its struggles, its moments of endurance, its quiet acts of connection. She gathered her snowy harvest and returned to the fire. Peter's fever spiked toward morning. His eyes were glassy, words fragmented by confusion. Guilt gnawed at Sarah, but alongside it grew a steadier emotion, respect for his courage and her son's, for the bond that now linked them. Even in frailty, Peter whispered encouragement as Jim refilled the water cup, drew the blanket snug, learned the necessary, gentle way of tending to the sick and lost. As the sky faded to a paler gray, the food nearly gone, Sarah knew another choice crept inexorably closer. But for one brief dawn, peace filled the cabin. 3 lives, bound together by need and care, by the kind of quiet courage most often left unsung. The first light of morning swept across the cabin, cold and pale, washing away the last vestiges of restless night. Sarah rose before either Jim or Peter, every joint aching, her body hollow from meager sleep and the thin rations of food. She replenished the fire until its soft glow filled the rough-hewn room, a barrier against the unyielding cold gathering at the corners. A new rhythm formed inside these walls, a choreography of shared purpose, each movement shaped by necessity and a quiet will to endure. Sarah organized the space as best she could, folding tattered blankets, arranging what remained of food in precise lines on the splintered table. Half a can of beans, 2 crackers, a scattering of dried berries she found deep in Peter's backpack. She used snow, laboriously melted on the stove, to boil water for cleaning, for drinking, for brewing bark tea that offered mere warmth rather than sustenance. Every action was deliberate. A ration for Peter, a ration for Jim, the scant remainder for herself. Her hands trembled as she chose not to take more, hiding the pangs of hunger from both men. The instinct to provide warred with the reality of limitation. Her mind spun with calculations. How long? How much? How to stretch every crumb into a shield against starvation. As Sarah cleaned and organized, Peter lay quietly in his cot, fever abating in short, fragile intervals. Jim moved through the small space with caution, at first wary of the injured man, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, drawn into the pattern of care. Sarah tasked him with watching the fire, bringing water from the melting pot, helping sort through the dusty supplies piling around the fireplace. By mid-morning, Jim's hesitance shifted into resolve, his hands deft in passing splinters of wood, his voice soft as he asked Peter whether he needed another blanket. Peter, in the rare lucid stretches, showed Jim how to tie simple knots, told him about tracking moose through the snow, about secret signs hunters used to find their way through the endless trees. Every story seemed to draw the boy nearer to courage. Jim asked gentle questions, unsure but persistent, his fear chiseled away by routine and shared tasks. Outside, the snow eased for a time. Sarah slipped on Peter's 2 large boots and stepped into the white morning, the world bright and cold, blue shadows cut into the drifts. She filled her battered pot with a scoop of fresh snow, looking up at the firs stitched with icicles, the sky dizzy with pale sunlight. For a fleeting moment, peace fell, a hush in the heart of the wilderness, untouched by hunger or dread. Sarah stood there, her breath visible, watching the wind reshape the drifts, marveling at the unlikely beauty of bitter cold. She thought of distant homes, her own place, the warm kitchen, forgotten routines. Pain returned with the memory. The last phone call from Jim's father, the uncertain edge in every conversation, the missed chance for comfort. But the beauty, the stillness, offered something else, a moment suspended above regret and fear. Inside the cabin, Sarah brought back water and gave Peter a fresh compress, stirring new bark into the boiling pot for tea. Peter opened his eyes clear for a moment, studying Sarah and Jim as they busied themselves. "I never knew a family could work together like this," he whispered, voice tight but grateful. Sarah smiled gently. "We became a team because we had to." Jim seated himself beside Peter and began recounting all he'd learned so far. How to split branches with a hatchet, how to keep the fire burning strong, how to tell the direction of north by looking for moss in the stars. Peter listened, his own pride reflected in the child's growing confidence. The lessons continued throughout the day. Peter, sometimes feverish and sometimes alert, explained the stories of the land. The reason for a path's curve, the mischief of raccoons, the ancient history carved into fallen logs and tracks. Sarah watched as Jim followed instructions, gathering wood, reinforcing the small barricade at the door, checking for cracks along the floor where drafts crept in. Little by little, the fear that had gripped Jim since their arrival faded. He stopped shying away from Peter, stopped clutching Sarah's arm in every new moment of uncertainty. At midday, Sarah found him quietly reading aloud from Peter's battered notebook, his voice soft, the words committing themselves to memory. Resourcefulness replaced anxiety. The kettle was always on, the fire was monitored in shifts, food was distributed with care. Yet every act of plenty masked a specter of loss. Sarah's stomach clenched with hunger, but she feigned fullness so Jim could eat. Peter, aware of this subtle giving, tried more than once to send his share back. "You need strength more than I do," he insisted. Sarah shook her head, voice firm. "You're healing. Jim's growing. I'll manage." Still, the dilemma thrummed beneath every hour. How much to give, how much to keep, and at what cost? The cabin shrank each day, its wooden walls growing close and familiar, a geography of hardship and hope. By the second evening, the storm swelled again outside, snow ticking and hissing at windows and roof, the air inside thick with the scent of wood smoke and melted bark. For Sarah, the hours blurred, marked only by the ritual of keeping life moving, warmth sufficient, and hunger at bay. Peter's recovery was a slow, fragile process, a battle measured by thermometer readings and the tint of the wound, by the color in his cheeks and the steadiness in his voice. He lapsed into fever still, but on good hours he told Sarah about his own children, about the early days working the boundaries of the preserve, about the old rituals hunters observed before setting out on winter days. In these moments, Jim listened quietly, sometimes reaching for the battered notebook to record a detail, sometimes responding with shy laughter. But beneath the surface of small victories, limitation gnawed. The last of the beans were divided, crackers gone. Sarah scraped the tin clean, coaxing Jim to eat the final crumb, pressing it into his palm as Peter watched. "We split what we have," she said. But Jim, lips trembling, offered half back to her. She took only a fragment, chewing slowly, hiding her hunger. Late on the third day, the snow stopped. Sarah seized the chance for fresh water, stepping outside into pristine silence. Night was coming soon. She crossed the snow in Peter's boots, breath clouding, every step a whisper in the hush. The world glowed, a sky of ice blue and pink, the trees stitched with frost. The wild paused for a heartbeat of grace. At the edge of the firs, Sarah knelt and filled her pot with snow. Standing up, she turned to view the landscape, and her eyes were drawn unexpectedly to tracks. Large prints, spaced wide, circling the cabin's perimeter. She stooped, fingers shaking, and traced the shape. Not a bear, wrong season. Not a fox, too large. Peter, hearing the creak of the door, called from inside, his voice tense. "Did you see anything out there? Anything strange?" Sarah returned and described the tracks. Peter listened, then nodded slowly, pain fracturing his face. "Wolf, I think. Maybe dog. Big. Maybe old and alone." Jim, wide-eyed, examined the snow prints in the candle's glow, his fear resurfacing but muted by curiosity. "Is it dangerous?" Peter shrugged. "Wolves usually keep distance. Alone, maybe hungry, maybe hurt." That night, the storm's peace proved deceptive. Jim woke, shivering, calling out to Sarah. "There's something outside. It's scratching the wall." Sarah listened, heart pounding. A deliberate scraping drifted through the logs, a patient, searching sound. Peter struggled to sit, clutching his rifle, finger tense on the trigger he'd loaded earlier. Sarah held Jim close, watching Peter's face for signals. Should they be afraid? Should they wait? Should they drive the animal away? The tension grew as the scratching continued, then faded, the creature circling once more before the silence thickened. In the end, Peter whispered, "It's looking for easy food, old, sick, maybe desperate. It'll come back." Sarah made a silent promise then, to protect Jim, to keep watch, to hold the cabin as sanctuary whatever battle played out in the wilderness beyond. During a quiet hour, Peter asked Sarah the question that had coiled in his mind since her arrival. "If things get worse, you have to take Jim and go. You have my axe and pack. You'll find the station." Sarah refused, her answer unyielding. "Nobody stays behind. Not even you." Her resolve softened only by the certainty of the child's wide eyes and the memories of all she'd already risked. Jim's moment of maturity came quietly. As Sarah divided the last of the water, he brought new wood to the fire, refilled the pot, tucked the blanket around Peter, and sat tall by the stove. Fear had not left, but in its place was something like pride, an understanding that helping others was a kind of strength. The cabin changed with him. Not a prison now, but a fragile home held together by care. Outside, the wind rose, the wolf's tracks shadowed the door, and three lives waited, together, under one roof, for what test would come at next dawn. Dawn brought a spectral quiet, broken only by the crunch of frost under Sarah's boots as she stepped into the crisp air beyond the cabin door. The sky above was swept clean, cold clarity tinted with a faint rose, snow-dusted trees arching into pale sunlight. The storm had left the world transformed, ground glittering, silence thick, the cabin half buried in wind-drifted snow. Something in the stillness set Sarah's nerves on edge. It was the tracks that told the story first, circling close around the cabin, large and deliberate. She followed their path with her eyes, a heavy animal, maybe limping, its trail pressed deep and staggered through the fresh snow. Returning inside, Sarah recounted what she'd seen. Peter was awake, teeth clenched from discomfort. "Wolf," he said, after a long look at the marks on Sarah's coat. "Might be an old male, hurt, alone, desperate enough to watch people. They do that sometimes out here when winter hits hard." Jim pressed his face to the window, peering into the wan morning. "Do wolves attack cabins?" Peter shook his head, slow, careful. "Not when there's fire inside. Not without pack. He'll keep his distance. Most times it's the starving or wounded ones come closest, looking for scraps, something easy." There was an uneasy tension to the day. Every sound outside gained weight. A sudden quiver in the snow, a cascade of ice falling from branches, the faint echo of something pacing just beyond sight. Sarah watched the forest, wary, while tending to duties inside. Melting snow for water, dividing the bark tea, checking Peter's wound for subtle betrayals of color or new heat. By mid-morning, Jim caught movement at the corner of his vision. He froze, heartbeat thundering. In the dimness between trees, a wolf emerged. A large, gray animal with one foreleg drawn stiff. It moved with difficulty, its eyes locked on the cabin, ears sharp to every motion within. Its fur was ragged, darkened by old blood at the leg. The wolf paused, watching the humans watch it, making no move to approach. It circled, head low, then sat on its haunches in the snow, gaze unwavering. For minutes that stretched and stretched, all inside the cabin held their breath, humans and animal locked in tentative negotiation. Peter spoke almost himself, his voice gravel and awe. "Never seen one come this close without reason. I think it knows we're as close to the edge as he is." The air hung heavy with meaning. The shared pull of wilderness upon animal and human, the faint thread of desperation that bound them together. Jim, trembling, whispered, "Should we feed him?" Sarah hesitated. Every rule told her no, not to tamper with the fragile balance, not to endanger the cabin. But something in the wolf's presence stirred a strange kinship, an understanding that survival was never a solitary journey. They waited, unmoving, until the wolf slowly limped away, returning to the shadow-deep trees. Jim watched the place where he'd vanished long after he was gone. The hours crawled forward, punctuated by care and worry. Peter slept fitfully. Sarah used the time to clean, to ration, to think. By afternoon, spirits in the cabin frayed. Jim restless, Peter slipping into fever-dense dreams, Sarah's own patience thin to thread. Then the wolf returned. It appeared as before, silent, watchful, this time closer, curiosity and caution dancing in its posture. Sarah beckoned Jim over, keeping her movements measured. She broke the last of the stale crackers, crumbled them into her palm, and stepped silently to the threshold, laying the morsels at the snow's edge. She retreated, heart pounding, and watched. The wolf approached cautiously, sniffed the air, one paw hovering in injury. Finally, it snatched the crumbs and retreated, vanishing into the rising dusk. In the hush that followed, Sarah felt Jim's small hand slip into hers. "He's just hungry, isn't he?" Sarah nodded, her eyes shining with a mix of fear, pity, and a fractured hope. "So are we." The wolf's prints lingered, circling the cabin, a new boundary drawn between them and the world outside. Night was sharp again, the wind keening through narrow cracks, the three huddling close to the embers of the fire. In those quivering hours between sleep and watching, Sarah looked at Jim's sleeping silhouette, Peter's gaunt profile, and imagined the wounded wolf somewhere out in the dark, alone, waiting for whatever scraps the world might give. She whispered into the dark, a promise for all who struggled. "Survive just one more night." The words floated out, lost or answered, she never knew. The next day dawned brittle and bright, every shadow sharp, every breath slicing through lungs. Sarah woke first, her muscles stiff, her mind dulled by worry. She placed fresh wood on the embers, glancing at Peter, who slept fitfully, sweat gleaming on his temples. Jim stirred in his blankets, eyes still heavy from broken sleep. As Sarah opened the cabin door, she found new tracks looping around the threshold, wolf prints, larger and more defined, mixed with the swirl of disturbed snow. The wolf had come again. She scanned the tree lean, heart pounding, searching the curtain of branches for movement. For a moment, the woods were still. Then, from the eastern shadows, the animal appeared. It walked with haunting deliberation, favoring its wounded leg, eyes bright with hunger and caution. Peter, now awake, watched through the tiny window. "Same animal," he said. "Probably knows there's food here, maybe even senses that we're no threat." Jim pressed his face close to the glass, his breath fogging the pain. "Should we scare him away, Mom? Or help him?" Sarah hesitated, weighing risk against empathy. The wolf prowled the perimeter, nose twitching, ears flickering. Peter reached for the rifle, but stopped when Sarah laid her hand gently on his arm. "I don't think he'll attack," she said quietly. "He's desperate, but he's more afraid of us than we are of him." The animal lingered, occasionally vanishing into the gloom, only to reappear, always circling, never quite daring to approach the door. Day bled into dusk, hunger gnawed at every stomach. That night, Sarah prepared the last spoonful of beans, rationed the remnants of the berries, and, despite her own rationing instincts, walked out onto the porch and placed the food away from the door at the edge of the snow. Jim watched with silent respect, his anxiety curdling into a kind of hope, connection rather than fear. Peter, tense, grumbled, "We feed him. He starts to think of this place like home. Might come back every day." Sarah nodded, accepting the risk, her gaze tracing the limping tracks. "If we were starving, wouldn't we hope for kindness from strangers?" That night, the wolf returned. It limped to the food, ate in quick, furtive bites, casting wary glances at the humans who watched behind icy glass. Then it vanished into the star-blurple night. Morning came again, hope as fragile as the snow dusting the path. The wolf's prints ringed the cabin, a silent testament to its presence. Jim stepped outside with Sarah and traced the freshest track with mittened fingers. These tracks are like ours, he mused. They show where we try to survive. Sarah smiled, kneeling beside him. Sometimes surviving means helping others, even ones who scare us. Throughout the day, the wolf appeared and disappeared, always limping, always hungry. Jim asked questions about why animals suffered, about whether mercy meant more than caution. He studied the animal from a safe distance, and, in small ways, his fear became curiosity. In a hushed moment, he turned to his mother. Are we saving him, or is he saving us? Sarah looked from her son to the wounded wolf in the frost, then to Peter, weak but watching, gratitude and unease mingling on his face. Sometimes, Jim, she said softly, it's both. That night, Peter's condition worsened. The fever returned, harsh and unrelenting. His words twisted with confusion, his body burning. Sarah fetched snow to keep him cool, pressed Jim to help boil water, whispered encouragement she scarcely believed. Outside, the wolf circled once more. Its prints mixed with the humans, a fragile boundary between two species struggling for life. Sarah watched the cabin window, fire flickering. The world narrowed to the question of how. When the last mercy had been given, the final warmth shared. Anyone could hold on until help arrived. Another dawn bled grimly across the sky. Sarah woke to the hush of deepening cold, her body already tuned to the rhythm of hardship. She pressed a palm to Peter's forehead. The fever was climbing, his skin slick with sweat, his breathing shallow and uncertain. Jim watched anxiously, clutching the battered compass, his thumb tracing the etched letters as if they could spell out a way forward. Peter's eyes flickered open, lost and lucid by turns, his words jagged with fatigue. Sarah can't last. Need help. More than I've got. Sarah sat quietly beside the stove, the last of the firewood nearly gone, the water in the pot little more than melted snow. Her mind searched for options, for solutions beyond the suffocating limits of the cabin. But every answer led back to the station on the river, the promise of a radio, the chance to reach someone, anyone who could come. We're out of time, Sarah whispered to herself, her voice clipped and steady. Jim, come here. She knelt in front of her son, brushing stray hair from his forehead, the gesture as much for her own courage as for his resolve. I'm going to have to go to the winter station for help, she said, voice calm and final. Jim stared at her, eyes wide with terror. You're leaving me? His voice was a cracked, shrill whisper, his body pulled tight with fear. Sarah hugged him, holding him close until his shaking slowed. If we go together, it might be days. I have to move fast. You'll stay here with Peter. You remember how to tend the fire, boil water, stay safe. I'll come back. So soon, you won't even notice. Jim nearly cried, but squeezed his arms around her neck, his own strength warring with despair. Promise? He breathed, barely audible. Sarah nodded. Promise. And we'll do this together, even apart. That's the only way we win. She packed her small rucksack with meticulous care. Peter's compass and knife, 3 matches, the last crust of cracker, and melted snow water. She taught Jim again how to stack wood for the stove, how to keep the door barred, how to ration the water and signal danger. Peter watched all preparations, voice just above a whisper. You're braver than most I've known. The river's your guide. Don't leave it, whatever happens. Northwest, hug the banks where the land dips. You'll see the radio pole when you're close. Sarah shouldered his old pack, the weight an anchor and a comfort. You'll keep Jim safe, and he'll keep you strong, she said, pressing both men's hands in her own. Jim placed the axe beside the stove, his fingers lingering on the handle. Mom, If the wolf comes, do I run? No, she said, voice low. Stay inside. Wolves avoid fire and noise. Just be careful. Keep a whistle around your neck. Jim nodded fiercely, holding back tears, clutching the whistle Peter found in his gear. The final act of sacrifice was simple and silent. Sarah gave all food to Jim and Peter, taking only snow water for herself. Her own hunger was a small price for speed. She wrapped herself in Peter's spare jacket, pulled her hat low, and stood in the doorway, the world raw and silver and infinite beyond. Watch for me in 2 days, Sarah said, imprinting the timeline on Jim's heart. If I'm not back by the end of the second evening, start the fire big and hang the red blanket in the doorway. That way, anyone nearby will see it. She watched his small face harden with duty, his childhood bending and shimmering into something almost older than time. Peter coughed, the sound rattling. Go now before cold gets worse. We'll hold as long as we can. Promise me you'll not take any foolish risks. Just follow the river and keep moving. Sarah nodded once, eyes bright with suppressed emotion. She stepped into the hush of the snow-draped world, her boots squeaking, the sky swallowing her silhouette almost instantly. She felt the river's presence to her left, the gentle murmur hidden under ice and drift, but constant. For a moment, she paused, looking back. Jim stood in the doorway, holding the axe, Peter beside him on his cot, both framed by the flickering warmth of the last fire. She raised a hand, and both echoed the gesture, silent promises migrating across icy air. Her journey began with small steps, each one away from certainty. The wilderness expanded, white and blue and looming. Before her, the river beckoned and threatened, each turn a gamble, each stone a new test. And behind, 2 souls waited, bound together by love and courage. Sarah moved fast, her boots sinking with each step, the frigid air stinging through layers both practical and borrowed. The river guided her, a ghostly companion, its voice muffled under ice but persistent, steering her northwest as Peter had insisted. The deeper she went, the more the wilderness expanded, blue shadows stretching into infinity, the world unbroken except for her own trail. Twice, she had to cross the river. Each time, stones glazed with ice threatened her balance. She paused, breath steaming, then launched herself with calculated risk, boots slipping, knees buckling as she landed on the opposite bank. No bridges, no footprints, no signs that anyone had passed through in weeks. Only the river's song, faint, steady, indifferent to whether she succeeded or failed. Each hour wore at her strength. Hunger pressed at her stomach. Her hands, numb then, burned with pain. She recalled distant remarks from her own mother, stories about the force of love against adversity, fire in the belly when the world offered only cold and doubt. A mother's love can move mountains, her mother had said once. Sarah understood now, with every gritted step, what that truly meant. Nature set obstacles at every twist. Once, the banks deepened into a sudden drop, a wall of ice and stone she had not expected. She circled, losing time, breath sharp, heart racing. She slipped, falling onto a sharp rock, pain flaring in her wrist and shoulder. She lay on her back for minutes, stars spinning high above the snow, willpower draining into defeat. But thoughts of Jim pulled her upright. She pushed, cursing and groaning, scrambling to her feet, limping forward. The pain in her hand throbbed. She flexed it, testing the range, accepting that it now pulsed with every movement. The world narrowed to survival, the logic of the trail, the rhythm of cold and hunger. She garnered every ounce of strength, remembering every lesson Peter had given, every whispered word from Jim before she left, every act of cautious love that now had to carry her forward. Midday brought a dizzy wave of exhaustion. Sarah stopped, sitting on a slab of ice, sipping melting snow from her bottle. She mapped the next stretch in her mind. The river split ahead. She had to follow the northwestern fork. The compass guided true, but uncertainty gnawed at her. She pressed her head into her knees, shivering, then forced herself onward. A blizzard rose suddenly, sweeping in with brute force. Visibility dived to mere feet. The world shrunk to a gray coil of snow, wind, and danger. Sarah blinked against the sting, letting the river's voice steer her steps, refusing to look back. She wrapped herself tighter, pulling her hat down, shoulders hunched against the drift. It was then, across a white expanse, that she saw movement. At first, she thought her mind was conjuring visions, a shadow against the ice, low and silent, keeping steady pace. Then clarity crept in. The wolf, limping, its form a blur, both warning and guide. The animal moved ahead, pausing whenever Sarah's stride faltered, turning its head as if to check on her. Its tracks pressed deep, clear, their pattern winding forward with patient certainty. Sarah followed. The wolf cleared the way, picking paths through drifts and danger. Sometimes she fell behind, the bite of pain and cold slowing her steps. Each time, the wolf waited, casting backward glances, silent encouragement that spoke more than words. As dusk fanned out across the taiga, they reached a thicket of firs. Sarah recognized the turn, the shape of the sky, the echo of distant mountains. Hope surged. The winter station was near. The wolf stopped on a patch of open snow, its breath ghostly in the twilight. Sarah paused, staring into the animal's amber eyes, both acknowledging struggle and declaring uneasy trust. The wolf turned then, slinking silently into the woods, vanishing in the dark as Sarah pressed forward. At last, cold and aching, she found a winter station. She broke the lock with a stone, her hand screaming in pain, her mind focused only on the promise of help. Inside, shadows clung to the walls, but she found a radio, bulky, battered, silent. She rifled through the supplies, her heart plunging when she discovered the batteries, dead, cold, stacked useless in the box. She lit the stove, chasing warmth into her bones, placing the batteries on the iron plate, watching them thaw with desperate hope. Night closed around her. Sarah kept watch, warming batteries, checking the radio, praying her signals would reach the world beyond. Sarah leaned against the iron belly of the stove, her breath steaming in the half-dark interior of the winter shelter. The heat crawled reluctantly from the iron, barely enough to thaw the shell of ice on the windows. She watched the batteries sweat and shiver as they warmed, every half hour turning them, checking for signs of life. Her injured wrist throbbed. She flexed her fingers slowly, the ache growing with each passing hour. The storm outside swelled. Winds howled and battered at the door, snow ticking on the roof like frozen ashes. The temperature dropped sharply, her breath now curling in denser clouds. She searched the lean supplies. A half-broken chair, 2 moldy boards, remnants of canned peas and rusted tins. Hardly enough would left for the night. She made a decision. With numb hands, she pried loose one of the floorboards, feeding it into the stove, the flame leaping greedily. Time diluted into strange measures. By the warmth that threatened to vanish, the hope that batteries would revive, the hunger that gnawed at her empty stomach. She sipped water boiled from snow, her thoughts circling Jim and Peter, imagining the night stretching before them in the fragile nest of the cabin. She sent silent prayers through the storm for their safety, for endurance enough till help arrived. Sarah checked the batteries again. still cold, still silent. Frustration pressed at her chest. She wanted to sob, not just for the ache in her wrist or the heaviness in her heart, but for the helplessness that clawed at every moment since the morning Jim begged her not to leave. Tears threatened, but she forced herself to work. Keep the fire alive, turn the batteries, stay awake. She drifted between wakefulness and exhausted sleep, each time jolting up in panic, convinced the flames had died. Each time, she nursed the fire back, feeding it whatever scraps she could steal from the crumbling shelter. Her eyes stung, her body beat to a rhythm of desperation and stubbornness. Out the window, the world flickered with pale green waves. Sarah froze for a long moment, watching the sky shimmer. Aurora, dancing mysterious, brief. Beauty in the heart of desolation, a rare gift. She pressed her hands to the glass, feeling awe cut through misery, longing seeping through resolve. She whispered, "Jim, hold on. I'll get help. I have to." The stove flared as she added the last board, heat blooming in a final, stubborn act of defiance. She checked the batteries. This time, one trembled with a faint glow. With trembling hands, she fitted it into the radio, twisting the worn dial, fingers slick with hope and fear. At first, only static. She shifted the dial minutely, heart thundering. This is Sarah Mitchell, lost in Flathead, injured. 2 others, 1 child, 1 wounded. Winter shelter, North River Station. Help needed, coordinates mapped inside. The radio crackled, sputtered, then, miraculously, a faint, staticky voice emerged. Copy. Flathead service. Weather holding rescue. Helicopter grounded. Ground team mobilizing. ETA 2 days. Food, medical, hang tight. Sarah closed her eyes, relief twisting with dread. 2 days, such a stretch, yet a lifeline found. She relayed all the details, her voice steadier now, spelling names and injuries, begging them to hurry if they could. When the connection faded into static, Sarah slumped next to the stove, head in hands, trembling. She wanted to sleep, but the flames were spent, her courage threadbare. Still, rescue was coming. Jim and Peter would not be alone. Outside, the storm beat against the walls. Inside, Sarah waited, battered, hungry, and burning with the tiny light of hope she had rekindled. Sarah sat by the stove as the first gray of dawn seeped into the shelter's cracked windows. For a moment after the radio call, relief had dulled her exhaustion, but now every ache and hunger returned doubly. She arranged the rescued batteries on the peeling table, checked them once more, her thumb trembling with fatigue and searching for hope. The night had been a dizzy kaleidoscope, small sleeps, frantic stoking of the stove, and constant fear she'd missed the rescue signal. She opened the shelter door, squinting through blowing snow. The world outside was a stark expanse, the riverbed marked by scattered ice and wind-whipped drifts. Cold had settled deep. Her injured wrist barely moved. She used her left hand to fill a battered pan with snow, shuffling back inside to pour the precious water into the kettle, savoring every drop. Her hunger was now less pain, more presence, a blank spot inside, crowding out the slower, softer thoughts. Sarah eyed the last piece of torn floorboard, calculating how many hours it might feed the fire, how many moments she'd need to stretch the warmth until help arrived. She pressed her palm to the window and focused on detail. The pale bands of dawn, icy branches arching over the winter station, the prints pressed into snow. Even here, so far, so cut off, the marks of life remained. Sarah filled her time and method, warming water, shifting blankets, rearranging splintered boards. She found a faded map in the desk drawer, traced the red lines to the word Flathead, marked the cabin, calculated routes, and escape plans in case the storm worsened again. When panic hovered, she forced herself into routine, counting breaths, rehearsing her return journey, remembering how Jim and Peter depended on her. Hour by hour, she whispered, clutching the compass close. Every good decision is hope. Mid-morning drifted toward midday, and Sarah tried the radio again, the batteries now fully thawed. Static hummed, then broke into a whisper. Road team stationary. No air extraction. Hold for weather. Hang on. She closed her eyes, holding the voice in her mind until it faded. Instructions remained the same. Wait, conserve strength, survive. She built the fire strong once more, prying off bits of another furniture leg, the shelter's bones slowly diminishing for her life. Sarah drifted into sleep, waking to the stove's wan light, the hunger a dull companion, the memory of Aurora's flickering behind her eyelids. Beauty, mercy, and endurance, thin threads but enough. When sunset crept across the world, she packed her things. Peter's compass, 2 matches, a scar from forgotten ranger, the map folded tight against her heartbeat. She piled the last board onto the fire, drank one final cup of hot water, then bundled up and stepped out into the snow. The storm had faded, leaving a world silent and still. Sarah paused, scanning for signs of life, measuring her own strength. The return would be difficult, cold, battered, but with purpose burning beneath fatigue. She looked once more to the pale green of northern lights now absent, whispered a blessing to the wild, and set out on the first step back to the cabin. Rescue within reach, hope warming her from inside out. The wind clawed at Sarah as she left the shelter, a living force that twisted snow in her eyes and stung every exposed patch of skin. Above, the sky hung leaden, flattening distances until only the river's muffled voice and the crunch of her boots assured her the world beyond hadn't ceased to exist. She moved slowly at first, adjusting the scarf, clutching Peter's heavy compass. Each step demanded careful attention. Snow had sculpted itself into treacherous patterns, hiding stones and brambles that threatened to twist an ankle or turn a fall deadly. Before Sarah had gone a mile, the blizzard returned with force. Visibility dropped to nothing, a white wall, swirling chaos. She fought panic, forcing herself to breathe by counting footsteps and reciting the instructions she'd given Jim. The river's sound was her only orienting guide. Fade and shift, the pattern of survival. Her senses narrowed to the exhaustion of movement. Each moment threatened surrender, a sweet temptation to lie down in the snow and close her eyes, to let cold lull her into ending. Sarah gripped the compass tighter, letting memories of Jim's small face, Peter's trembling hands, her own mother's stories push her forward. Survival was no longer a goal, it was raw necessity. Twice she lost the riverbank. Twice she found it by stumbling, hands pressed to icy earth, ears straining for the faint rush of water. She moved more by instinct now. Animal as much as human, her body reduced to need, will, and a distant, burning love. When she had nearly given in, legs numb, thoughts fragmenting, the shadow appeared again. The wolf, spectral and silent, emerged from the storm not 10 yards ahead. Its coat was bristled with ice, its limp exaggerated by fatigue, but it moved with purpose, casting a wary glance back. Sarah blinked, reaching for meaning. The wolf was her marker, a living orientation point in the blinding blizzard. She followed its trail, matching pace, hungering for every clue. Each time the wolf chose a path, she trusted its decision more than her own frozen logic. Sometimes it paused, waiting beneath wind-bent branches, watching until Sarah approached, then moving ahead. The rhythm of its tracks created a map no compass could offer. Fresh prints pressed into snow, a line that wavered only to avoid danger, never without cause. Sarah's breath rasped in her chest. Pain flared in her hand each time she used it for balance. Hunger gnawed at her insides. Cold blurred the world, but she held fast, keeping her eyes locked on the wolf's tantalizing progress. Hours blurred. The storm shifted in violence, sometimes ebbing, sometimes roaring. At one point, Sarah collapsed in a drift eye level with the wolf's trail. The animal doubled back, approached her with wary caution, its eyes full of something more than animal curiosity, a recognition, perhaps a vulnerability. She pushed up, whispering, "Keep moving." For Jim, for Peter, for all the small hopes in the wild. The wolf turned, leading on. Distance became immeasurable, a tapestry of white and blue, each step a triumph of will. Gradually, the snow thinned, the river's voice sharpened, and the cabin's outline took form. A lean silhouette huddled against the winter's fury. The wolf paced the tree lean as Sarah stumbled home. She paused, hands on knees, pride and exhaustion mingling as she watched the animal vanish in the woods, its deed complete. Sarah staggered to the cabin's door, pounding twice, her voice weak but determined. "Jim! Peter!" Inside, the world exploded with sound. Jim flung his arms around her, sobbing. Peter pressed his fevered hand to hers, voice drained but alive. Sarah collapsed near the fire, unable to speak for several minutes. Jim explained, amid tears and broken sentences, that the wolf had visited several times. He hadn't come near, but had circled, howled, even once sat by the window as if on watch. Sarah held him, feeling warmth return, the terrible journey giving way to the astonishment of reunion. She looked at Peter, who, though fading, smiled, a tremor of hope lighting his eyes. In the hush that followed, Sarah recounted the radio call, the rescue promise. Snow battered the roof above. The fire snapped and burned, and they waited, together, for the final trial. The hours after Sarah's return blurred into a battle against time. Hunger and cold. Inside the cabin, the fire burned with desperate intensity, casting gangly shadows on the walls and bathing the three survivors in a frail mote of warmth. The blizzard battered the roof above, snow cascading down in waves, every gust threatening to snuff out their sanctuary. Sarah's entrance had invigorated the cabin with hope and physical energy, but the food was gone, save for a few stray crumbs. Jim tried to give some to Sarah, but she split his gift in half, urging him to take more. They ate slowly, chewing for long minutes, tricking their bodies into believing a feast had taken place. Peter drank water, every motion labored, his eyes jumping between gratefulness and pain. Outside, the storm intensified. Hours ticked by as the wind howled. The world contracted, the only sense of reality housed in the flicker of flames and breath. Sarah wrapped Peter's blanket tighter around Jim and herself, drawing her son in her side while Peter, pale and intermittently lucid, watched the fire. At times, laughter punctuated the tension, nervous, hollow, but real. Jim recited stories learned from Peter about animal tracks, about why pine trees grew in clusters, little riddles Sarah never had energy to solve before. Peter, in one rare moment of clarity, squeezed Sarah's hand, whispering, "You kept me alive. You kept him brave. That's more than most manage." More hours passed. Snow piled high at the doors and windows. The hunger gnawed at their spirits as much as their bodies. Sarah rationed every last sip of melted snow, giving Peter the lion's share. knowing his fever demanded more. Jim's hands grew shaky. Sarah watched him give her the last piece of cracker, nearly crying with pride and sorrow as she returned half to him. They both laughed, a strange mingling of joy and pain, dividing what little they had because it was the only way to survive. Night pressed in, the storm refusing to abate. Peter's fever peaked, but for a single hour his mind cleared. He whispered thanks to Sarah and Jim. "You saved me. Against the odds. I always thought I'd in alone out here. But you gave me hope, even if you saved yourselves more than me." Jim hugged Peter, his own childish grief buried in the simple act of caring. Sarah watched, tears burning in her eyes, feeling the moment as both a mercy and a wound. The fire dwindled near dawn. Sarah rose, fed the last stick of wood to the flames, casting her gaze over Jim and Peter. She whispered one more day, "We hold together, no matter what." Out in the storm, the sounds changed. No longer the hungry scream of wind, but a subtler pulse, an engine, something mechanical. Jim sat up, eyes wide. "Is that?" Sarah pressed her ear to the window, straining. The rhythm grew, the unmistakable thrum of snowmobiles. Rescue, or at least its promise, had finally arrived. She rushed to the door and pushed it open, blinking against loose snow. In the distance, flickers of headlights bobbed between trees, men in heavy jackets approaching, their voices muffled by gear and snow. Sarah waved wildly, her whole body trembling. Jim joined her, shouting, hope springing to life in his chest. Peter tried to sit up, and Sarah helped him, supporting his frail form as the rescuers burst through the snowed-in porch. The rescue team entered, hands warm and sure, distributing blankets, water, field rations. Sarah nearly collapsed as relief flooded through her. Jim ate hungrily. Peter was hooked instantly to 4 antibiotics and covered in insulated layers. The rescuers scanned the world outside, amazed by the amount of snow, by the tracks, human, wolf, all intertwined, layered and looping around the cabin. As the team prepared the stretcher for Peter and packed Sarah and Jim for transport, the storm finally loosened its grip on land. Sarah helped Jim into a jacket, then turned to see wolf tracks pressed fresh against the drifts, circling, as if to say goodbye. She looked out to the woods, silence, depth, and the legacy of survival bowing to the hopeful rhythm of motors and warmth. Sunrise bled slowly across the snow, painting the land in streaks of gold and blue, ice flashing along the banks of the river. The rescue team worked in new, gentle rhythms, food packages distributed, blankets draped across weakened shoulders, voices quiet but certain. The world, so recently cramped in the shape of a cabin, now stretched to include men with bright gear, sleds humming and rattling, a horizon promising warmth and safety. Sarah helped Jim don a thick jacket, his face hidden behind layers of wool and wonder. He stood silent beside her, absorbing each detail, the taste of real bread, the feel of gloves without holes, the sound of adults talking about roads and towns in return. Peter, bundled tightly and propped upright on his cot, smiled weakly each time he glanced at Sarah and Jim. When a medic leaned close, checking his he whispered, "She did it. She got us through." The words echoed, buoyed by gratitude and awe. Sarah moved through the cabin with new energy. She gathered what little remained, a single scarf, an empty thermos, Peter's battered map. She folded each item with care, her eyes lingering on the hearth where the last ember flared. The fire now was more than heat. It was a mark of unity, survival, and a hope that burned well past the edge of necessity. Outside, Jim and Sarah watched the men pack their sleds. The snowmobiles roared, engines coughing to life, and the team ready to depart. Sarah hesitated a moment longer, scanning the world for a final sign. She walked past the tree line, footprints crisp, boots sinking into the soft crust. There, at the edge of the forest, the wolf waited, limping, silent, its eyes golden, fur bristling with cold and triumph. They stood, two survivors bound by something deeper than hunger or need. The wolf watched Sarah. She whispered, "Thank you," voice hoarse, breath spinning in the wind. It lingered, then, as the sun crested, turned and vanished among the pines. Sarah felt tears burn in her eyes, a sadness sweetened by hope, a gratitude for all that was lost and found. She rejoined Jim, grasping his hand tight. As they mounted the snowmobile and sped toward the nearest village, Sarah looked back. The cabin, the fire, the intricate web of footprints. Hers, Jim's, Peter's, the rescuers, and the wolf's, all interlaced. For the first time, she truly felt the meaning of the trail. Not of loss, but of journey, shared, survived, and remembered. Village life greeted Sarah and Jim in gentle waves. Warm rooms, hot soup spooned from vast pots, beds with real sheets, the steady warmth of voices rising through the morning. The rescue team ushered them inside, their boots muddy, their hearts still pacing to the rhythm of the snow and silence they'd left behind. Peter arrived later, bundled and pale, his cheeks pinked by the flush of new medicine. In the local clinic, he stretched beneath thick blankets. The four dripped steadily, color returning to his face like mist dissolving before the sun. Sarah visited him each morning, Jim in tow, the boy's hand squeezing hers with a strength built from ordeal and repair. Each day, they shared stories. Peter explained how the forest taught him to respect weakness as much as strength. He drew stories from days on boundary patrols, his voice stronger now, each detail landing in Jim's memory like a bright stone in cold water. Sarah reflected on her choices, each mistake, each moment of courage, now softened by the knowledge that survival required as much surrender as willpower. She remembered how she had felt compelled to prove herself against worlds of weather and expectation, but saw now that unity mattered more than independence, mercy greater than control. Weeks passed. Peter healed, moving with gentle ease around the hospital garden. Jim gained back weight, his laughter multiplying, his eyes now less wary and more curious. Sarah herself felt a new steadiness, her hands skilled now at 1,000 tasks, splitting wood, feeding fire, comforting the fearful, accepting help. When the first chill of November faded into the brevity of December sun, Sarah, Jim, and Peter gathered in the square for a small celebration. Medics brought blankets. Neighbors dropped off baskets of bread, jars of honey, a photograph Sarah had never seen. Peter shaking hands with the rescue leader. Jim traced the image with a reverence born of gratitude. The boy's own hand pressed to Sarah's wrist. In the quiet after the gathering, Jim asked the question he had carried since that night at the cabin. "Will we go back? Sometime together?" Sarah smiled, brushing his hair out of his face, her gaze resting on Peter's steady hands and her son's determined eyes. "When we're ready, and this time we'll do it right. Not alone, not careless, together." She thought of the wolf, of his path circling the snow, the way tracks mingled. Hers, Jim's, Peter's, strangers, and the wild. In the memory, loss became path and all fear became possibility. That evening, as the moon lifted above the snowy fields, Sarah stood at the window and whispered thanks to the taiga, to the wolf, to the fire that had carried her to hope. Somewhere in the shadowed forest, the wolf paused, looked once toward the village, then melted back into the wild. the living echo of every traveler's journey, the proof that survival was always shared.